Welcome to the Policy and Practice Seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Politics and the School of Public Policy. It's a special year for UCL because this is our 200th anniversary. We were, the first university in London, and as part of these celebrations, UCL is hosting 200 talks, and Policy and Practice series is part of that. And very especially, this event is one of those 200 events that we have ahead of us this year. So we're going, and I think there's some very interesting themes. I'll tell you about the next one at the end of the session. But to start, my name is Philip Ayub. I'm a professor here in the department at UCL, and I'll be your chair for today. And I'm very, very excited to be sitting alongside and in front of, since we have one behind me on Zoom, these wonderful panelists that I'll introduce in a moment. But I want to welcome you to the topic of this seminar, which is on LGBTIQ plus rights, the state, and democratic decline. This event explores key trends in LGBTIQ politics across global North and South, examining how shifting political landscapes are reshaping the relationship between LGBTIQ movements and state actors. In recent years, we've seen both remarkable advances in the formal equality and intensification of backlash against sexual and gender minorities, often tied to broader processes of democratic erosion, populism, geopolitical contestation. These dynamics raise important questions about how rights are institutionalized, how they are resisted, and how active advocates and policymakers respond in increasingly polarized political environments. The discussion will also, and I think this is a really important and neat part of this event today, highlight the creativity and resilience of LGBTIQ activists who continue to build powerful strategies of solidarity and resistance in very challenging times. So to talk about these issues today, we have a wonderful lineup of 4 speakers. To my right, we have Rahul Rao, who's a reader in international political thought at the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews. Before that, actually just down the road at SOAS, but now coming from Scotland to join us. Much of Rahul's work to date has explored the global politics of identity, gender, sexuality, race, and caste. Rahul has published widely in leading journals and peer-reviewed presses, including recent works. One that my students love a lot is Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Postcoloniality, published in 2020, which followed other important books. And then a recent book that I'd like to plug, which I haven't read yet, but I'm excited to read, is The Psychic Lives of Statues, which is on the toppling and erection of statues, analyzing them as sites of resistance against colonialism, racism, and casteism. To my left, we have Anushka Ganawardena, who's a senior lawyer at the Human Dignity Trust working across Asia and Pacific regions. She specializes in international human rights law and has over a decade of experience instituting strategic litigation, implementing multi-country regional programs, working for global human rights organizations, and advising government bodies on how to devise national policies. Among her many award-winning endeavors, before joining Human Dignity Trust, she has worked internationally also at the International Federation of Human Rights in Paris and at Human Rights Watch in Washington, D.C. It's wonderful to have you join us today. Behind me, we have Dan Conway, who is joining us today from South Africa, though usually he would be not too far from here at the University of Westminster. Where Dan is a professor and also research associate at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. His work is situated at the intersection of feminist international relations, political sociology, queer theory, focusing on a politics of LGBT rights and activism. Dan's latest book, which we hope to hear a little bit about today, is The Queer Politics of Pride, Global LGBTQ plus Activism and Homocapitalism, which is really a fantastic book that draws on extensive ethnographic fieldwork at Pride events all over the world, from South Africa to South and East Asia to Cuba and New York. So really a unique book, and it's really in the breadth of its perspectives of how LGBT rights are fought in different places. Wonderful to have you, Dan. And then last, but certainly not least, at the end here, we have Jamie Hagan, who's a lecturer in global politics at the University of Manchester. And Jamie works on critical global Politics Research Cluster. I think I've had too many words so far. Jamie is also founding co-convener of Queer Justice, Peace and Security Community of Practice. Jamie's research, which has been published in several leading journals, is at the intersection of gender, security studies, queer theory, and always brings a feminist, intersectional, anti-racist approach to these fields. Jamie's most recent book is Queering Women, Peace and Security, Expanding Feminist Approaches to Gender and Peace Building, which was published just last year. Before that, Jamie has also had a lot of related work and books on queer conflict studies, which I think for our department especially is very interesting because we have a lot of researchers working in the conflict space, and Jamie is one of the first scholars who has really brought queer perspectives to that field. So those are our speakers. As you can see, we have a lot of exciting perspectives in store for us. Each speaker will open the session by speaking for about 5 minutes, and then we will have a short panel discussion before turning it over to the audience. And we do want to make sure to give you an opportunity to speak, so we'll try to reserve 30 and very minimum 25 minutes at the end of the session for you to ask questions. So do please feel free to write down your notes as you're thinking here today. A final note before I hand over to our first speaker: the whole session, including the Q&A, will be recorded, and we usually post these on the department's website and the seminar's YouTube channel. So just please note that if you speak, you will be heard on a recording. So keep that in mind, and of course, when the recording is available, you'll also have access to it. We will let you know. All right, thank you so much for joining us all tonight, and I'll hand over to Rahul.
Thanks very much, Philip, and thank you all for coming here. Because we've been given only 5 minutes to start, I'm going to get straight into it. Over the past few weeks and days, I've been asking myself again how one opposes both Western imperialism and the authoritarianism of states that oppress women, queer, trans, and other gender and sexual minorities, particularly when these entities are opposed to one another, as in the current war between the US and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other. To be very clear, while I have many critical things to say about the Islamic Republic of Iran, I categorically and unequivocally call for a cessation of the US and Israel's unprovoked and illegal bombing of the country, their killing of innocent civilians, and their unleashing of ecocide. That said, I've been preoccupied now, but also throughout my career, with the question of how one refuses the false choice between imperialism and authoritarian nationalism, a choice that is urged on us by the right, but also some parts of the left. And it's the left argument that bothers me, because that's my side, which sometimes is heard claiming that opposing Western imperialism requires lending one's support to counter-hegemonic actors, regardless of their politics: Russia, China, Khamenei's Iran, Assad, Syria, etc. I wrote my PhD thesis and the book on which it was based, Third World Protest Between Home and the World, in the thick of the Iraq War of 2003, frustrated by a similar dynamic in which it felt as if an anti-war left calling for no war on Iraq had little to say about Saddam Hussein's crimes. In that work, I became interested in an alternative anti-colonial canon populated by figures who had been critical of both imperialism and nationalism, even before their respective states and societies had won their freedom. So people like Rabindranath Tagore, James Joyce, Frantz Fanon, and especially Edward Said, who was always relentlessly critical of both Israeli imperialism and occupation and the supineness and corruption of the Palestinian Authority, a very difficult thing to do simultaneously. I'm not an expert on Iran, but neither is Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth. But I do care about expertise on Iran, so I'm trying to educate myself. It was a global/Western controversy over queer rights in Iran that first provoked my interest in queer struggles anywhere in the world. In July 2005, this feels like ancient history, but actually it's not, because two boys, or men, we're not sure how old they were, Ayaz Marhoni and Mahmoud Askari, variously reported to have been between 16 and 18 years of age, were hanged by the government of Iran in the city of Mashhad for an alleged crime involving homosexual intercourse. The execution provoked a fierce and very polarized debate amongst Western activists. So you had individual freelance activists like Peter Tatchell and Doug Ireland, who assumed that the boys had been hanged for their sexuality, fiercely denounced the government of Iran, calling it Islamofascist, accusing it of initiating a pogrom against homosexuals, demanded Western action, intervention, and on the more right-wing end of the gay rights spectrum, gay Republicans in the US, arguing that this supplied a gay reason for the war on terror. This sort of flashpoint was one of the maybe earliest provocations for Jaspir Puar's theorization of what we now know as homo-nationalism. On the other side of the debate were not people saying nothing should be done, but talking about a reframing of the language in which Western activists ought to respond. So Scott Long, then of Human Rights Watch, was a good example of this position. And he said that given the uncertainty over whether the boys' men were executed for rape or consensual sex, the way to reframe this issue was to talk about the execution of minors, which is problematic regardless of what they were being accused of. But the US hardly had the moral standing to do that because it was itself executing juveniles till a Supreme Court decision in March 2005. And there were, of course, concerns that the homo-nationalist kind of claim could widen the global war on terror from Iraq to Iran, as seems to have now happened. I took on some of these problems in my next book, Out of Time, which Philip mentioned, which was especially concerned with the global politics of the Ugandan Anti-Homosexuality Act. Like Puar and others, I wanted to be critical of the homo-nationalism of Western states and civil society that spoke ad nauseum about the primordial queer phobia of the less developed world. But as a citizen of a country that continued to criminalize homosexuality till 2018, I'm a citizen of India, I also wanted to be critical of the queer phobia of post-colonial states. And the question for me was, how could I find a language in which to be critical of that post-colonial queer phobia without lapsing into the racist and orientalist narratives of homo-nationalism? And to my mind, there are two strategies for doing this, and I'll just in a very headline fashion mention them before wrapping up. The first is not to be distracted by the fictions of state boundaries and sovereignty, but to think in terms of transnational relationships and collaborations. Call this the Marxist sensibility, if you like, because it's rooted in the inherently transnational category of class. So by thinking about transactional relationships between American evangelical Christians and Ugandan politicians and clergy, I and many others were able to make sense of the Anti-Homosexuality Act, not as evidence of some primordial Ugandan homophobia, but as a transnational collaboration that served the distinct but resonant needs of elites in different places. The second strategy you might think of as a kind of psychoanalytic strategy. How do categories of self and other form in opposition to and in relation to each other? How do apparently antagonistic formations end up constituting each other? In her book, Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, the Iranian gender historian Afsane Najmabadi offers a compelling account of how a society like Iran, which is saturated with depictions of same-sex eroticism and love in poetry, painting, memoir, and life writing, and courtly culture, is transformed, heteronormalized in the late 19th century under the European gaze. She argues that when modernist Iranian elites increasingly came into contact with European modernity and began to understand that this more advanced civilization, advanced in quotes, viewed same-sex desire as an abomination, they became determined to reconstitute their own societies in more heterosocial and heterosexual ways. The irony, of course, is that in the 21st century, Iran is seen as too heterosexual, homophobic, necessitating yet another round of catching up with the West, this time by running in the opposite direction. Although, and I'm going to wrap up here, although this might sound like the West eternally sets the standard of civilization, I want to open up the question or the possibility that this dynamic might finally have run its course or be ending in what I see as the current collapse of Western moral authority. That collapse is evident certainly as a result of the West's complicity in or perpetration of the genocide in Gaza, but it's also evident in the realm of LGBT+ rights, where democratic backsliding in the West means that it no longer occupies the moral high ground from which to pontificate and lecture to the rest of the world. The collapse of that moral authority is long overdue. Finally, even liberals can see it. But I absolutely do not celebrate the cessation of global flows of aid from the global north to the global south around issues like LGBT rights, HIV, and public health. That cessation of aid has been devastating in many places. From the perspective of white nationalists, the resurgence of Western societies seems to necessitate their re-virilization, which entails stamping out all traces of feminism and gender queerness in public life at home, but also withdrawing support to such constituencies abroad. This is what the MAGA agenda is. From my perspective, such support, global aid, should never have been thought of as aid, benevolence, charity, but as reparation for colonialism and slavery. And so the withdrawal of aid is a problem, not because once wise and enlightened norm setters have suddenly lost the plot, but because the perpetrators of historical and ongoing crime have not discharged their obligations of cessation and reparation. That is the reason to mourn the loss of US aid in this current moment. As just one example of that collapse of authority.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks. And just to pick up on what Rahul mentioned about Iran as a criminalizing state that criminalizes same-sex intimacy, I represent an organization called Human Dignity Trust, and our organization supports LGBT organizations around the world, civil society activists, in repealing laws that criminalize same-sex intimacy around the world. Currently, in 2026, there are 65 countries, jurisdictions around the world that criminalize same-sex intimacy. And we have a unique model where we are international lawyers who work together with lawyers in these criminalizing countries and devise national strategies and legal strategies towards repealing these laws through courts. So I'd like to reflect on, within the last 4 years, what are the developments that have been happening in the global south? What kind of strategies have LGBT movements been advocating for to repeal these laws, either through their parliament or either through courts? So one of the first cases that came about, one of the positive decisions that came about in 2022 was before an international human rights tribunal, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This was a case that HTT supported Rosanna Flema Caldera, a Sri Lankan lesbian activist, in bringing a communication before the UN CEDAW committee, where she said that criminalization of same-sex intimacy between women is not consistent with the convention on the elimination, the CEDAW convention rather. And this is a landmark decision where the CEDAW committee found the intersectional discrimination of, because you're a woman who is also a lesbian, bisexual, and intersex woman, based on your sexual orientation and based on your gender, there can be intersectional forms of discrimination. And this was a positive outcome that came about in the International Tribunal. And then in the domestic cases, you see that there were 3 cases that followed in the Caribbean. First, in Antigua and Barbuda, followed by St. Kitts and Nevis, and then in Barbados, where it was part of a regional strategy to bring about a series of cases to repeal laws through court. HTT was part of the inception of this regional strategy, which was led by a group called ECADE. And this was a regional strategy where regional lawyers, international lawyers, different communication specialists came together to institute these cases and repeal these laws. In another part of the world, in Asia, in Singapore, following 10 years of consistent litigation, which were all unsuccessful, the government of Singapore finally was compelled, as a result of this litigation, to repeal Section 377A from their penal code. So these are laws that have been promulgated as a result of colonization, to British colonization, and they have been promulgated around the world. And this, in 2022, we see so many different positive outcomes that have resulted, where at an international level and through domestic cases as well, where these laws were starting to overturn. And in 2023, in another part of the world, in the Pacific, civil society movements in the Cook Islands worked together with the leader of the opposition, Tina Brown, in advocating for the repeal of criminalizing laws, and they were successful. And that same year, in Africa, in Mauritius, this was another case that HTT supported, where a litigant called Ryan R. Seek worked together with HCT as well as a wonderful group of lawyers in the country in bringing about a constitutional claim to repeal Section 250 that criminalized same-sex intimacy between men. And importantly, in this case, not only did courts strike down Section 250, the courts also recognized that Section 250 was a colonial law. It didn't reflect Mauritian values. And following this success in 2024, there was other successes that happened around the world, starting from Dominica in the Caribbean, and then again in Namibia, in Africa, another case that HCT supported, Friedel Darsab, as well as with the support of a Namibian organization called Positive Vibes, in repealing their criminalizing laws. However, while the High Court brought about a favorable outcome, this case was appealed and is currently under appeal. And beyond just the decriminalization cases, there have been also other positive movements that have happened. In countries that have already decriminalized, such as in Seychelles, that decriminalized in 2016, in 2024, they went further. They thought, let's bring about hate crime laws these protective legislation that provide protections for LGBT people and others who are subject to hate crimes. And this was a law that was drafted with the technical expertise of HCT as well. And then last year, St. Lucia became the most recent country in the world to decriminalize same-sex intimacy and repeal these laws through their statute books. And what we see through this trend I only spoke about just a very short period of time of 4 years. When you think about social justice movements, which expand for decades and decades, there has been massive momentum towards decriminalization because it's a recognition by LGBT people working together with lawyers, lawmakers, communication specialists, and others that equality and non-discrimination is at the heart of every constitution. And these constitutional values and principles should apply to all citizens. And that is what we recognize and that we see in these beautiful judgments that have come across in different parts of the world. And while 65 countries still retain criminalizing provisions, there are positive signs of these momentums that have been building, these coalitions that have been forming, that have aspired and inspired so many different people around the world in the global south through constitutional strategic litigation or through legislative reform to bring about positive change. And I'll close with that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll just pass it on to Jim. Or actually, no, sorry. We'll go first to Dan now. Dan, you're on.
Hi, everyone, and greetings from Johannesburg. I've been sort of dwelling on hopelessness, and I was listening to the queer trans singers Anoni's album Hopelessness today. And this week I've been running a workshop in Pretoria with diplomats working on LGBTQ plus advocacy. And of course, these are a dwindling number of people and somewhat openly discussing their feelings of hopelessness and saying they thought it was only a matter of time before the national governments changed the already sort of limited commitments to LGBT rights. And as Rahul indicated, development budgets are declining, if not being removed. And this makes any work in human rights very challenging. And I think with it amongst that, it's very important to be clear and truthful about how the limits and sometimes contradictory progress that has been made when we consider backlash and rollback against LGBTQ plus rights. And perhaps some of us should have felt hopeless sooner, notwithstanding the sort of legal changes that Anushka has been talking about. But it's been very important to sort of critique the liberal conceit of it gets better. And continuing the diplomatic example, only 4 cents out of every $100 of international development funding was ring-fenced for LGBTQ plus rights. And in many cases, the diplomatic and foreign policy focus on this area has been something of an afterthought in relation to the main business of security and trade. Similarly, there's been a lot of commentary about the pullback of corporate sponsors from Pride and the cancellation of EDI programs. But of course, only 6 pence out of every £100 of corporate social responsibility funding was spent on LGBT clauses. And this is notwithstanding the very problematic politics surrounding EDI and corporate involvement in Pride. As Philip said, I've recently published a book called The Queer Politics of Pride, and this features Pride in South Africa. And last month I went to Cape Town Pride again, and Cape Town Pride was celebrating the 30th anniversary of same-sex marriage in South Africa. And Pride in South Africa's focus and celebration of legal rights such as same-sex marriage has been termed a murderous inclusion because it masks the reality of gender-based homophobic and transphobic violence in South Africa, and the fact that LGBTQ plus constitutional rights are not matched by the lived reality of those rights in multiple ways. Cape Town Pride takes place in a picturesque gay village in what must surely be one of the most gentrified cities in the global south. This all conceals the fact that just a few miles away, there are some of the highest rates of violence and poverty anywhere in the world. Cape Town is governed by the white-led opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, who dominate Cape Town's Pride Parade, and the DA opens the ticketed after-party, making it feel like a DA political rally. The DA literally want to conceal the reality of life and death in Cape Town, and are currently proposing to build what has been termed an apartheid wall that will hide the squatter camps and townships from motorists on their way from the airport. But Cape Town Pride conceals the reality of queer lives and death already. Similarly, Johannesburg Pride, which in 1990 was led by liberation struggle activists and took place in the chaotic streets of downtown Joburg, is now a registered business and takes place in Sandton City, a luxury shopping mall in the wealthiest square mile in Africa. Last year, Johannesburg Pride was to all intents and purposes a large music festival with a VIP area, social media influencers, and it was sponsored by Mercedes, among others. And as its organizer told me, Johannesburg Pride is premised on the belief that South Africans are, to quote her, beyond human rights now, and that since queer activists, other NGOs, and Soweto Pride in the former Black Township were not catering for the money class of South Africans, whom in her words live in fancy houses and take fancy holidays and need somewhere safe to park their cars, Johannesburg Pride is there to fill the gap. Now, alongside the high rates of violence, there's evidence that South African social attitudes are becoming more homophobic. And former President Jacob Zuma put rollback on the political agenda at last year's national elections when he said LGBT rights were Dutch law and not African law, and he would remove them if his party, the MK party, came back to power. MK is now the largest opposition party. So the politics of Cape Town Pride and Johannesburg Prides, I think, are pretty much interchangeable with prides in London, Brighton, New York, Sydney, or World Pride, or First World Pride, as one of my friends drolly calls it. And incidentally, World Pride is due to take place in Cape Town in 2028, which will be very worth watching for. In my recent book, I argue that these prides should not be considered as radical political or activist events at all. And the organizers and defenders of these mainstream pride events are part of a gentrified class of LGBTQ plus actors who might argue have helped land us where we are today by having hollowed out social justice activism and producing a key platform for what Rahul has so well identified as homocapitalism. Now, this being said, Pride can be a site of social justice politics, and one that reveals the reality and precarity of queer lives and deaths in the global south. And in my book, I explore Soweto Pride, Hong Kong Migrants Pride, which is migrant domestic workers, the Queer Liberation March and Reclaim Pride movement, and disruptive queer protests within gentrified mainstream prides as being examples of this. But of course, it's important to remember that Pride's model of open defiance is not a safe or viable strategy in most of Africa and parts of Asia. I was also thinking today, and I often dwell on how hopeless Black South Africans and anti-apartheid activists must have felt in the mid-80s at the height of apartheid. And it's also sobering to think how hopeless it must have felt to have been diagnosed with HIV in the 1980s, facing a despised existence, no treatments, and an untimely death. But born out of these senses of hopelessness were radical, multifaceted, grassroots social and political movements for social justice, encompassing everything from violence, shocking confrontation, but also sophisticated lobbying and high-level engagements with government. As Sarah Schulman writes, the queer activists of ACT UP achieved incredible success, and it forced the US to change against its will, permanently impacting future movements of people with AIDS throughout the world. The same can also, of course, be said about the South African liberations movement. And while both are important case studies to think through and learn from about how we can challenge extreme right-wing populism and anti-gender politics, both ACT UP and the ANC are also salutary examples of what happens if movements don't fully engage with and challenge neoliberal capitalism. There's unequal access to healthcare, and South African inequality are the results of the accommodations with neoliberalism. And it's this very economic model that serves as the basis for the resentful right-wing populist backlash we face. So I'd like to end by returning to Anoni's songs on hopelessness. Anoni was asked why has she written what on the surface seems to be such a despairing and disquieting album, and she replied, "I'm trying to hold space for reality as it stands today, to try to understand what's going on, what's really happening. What's my relationship to it? I wanted to raise my voice because I feel like raising your voice is the antidote to a sense of powerlessness. I mean, hopelessness is a feeling, not a fact. And I think that desire to reveal the reality and precarity of the world we live in and queers die in, to think through in what ways and in what circumstances we are complicit in injustice, what it means to do social justice activism. And this, for example, is what Pride Defense should be doing. And this is the only way I think we can move beyond a feeling of hopelessness." Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'll pass to Jamie now.
So I wanted to start, I'm a co-convener of the Queer Justice, Peace and Security Community of Practice, and I wanted to start by reading part of a statement we released, which includes a quote from an Iranian-French executive director of the eco-queer feminist organization Spectrum, who writes, "In a country where every single detail of one's life is controlled and dictated by the authorities, where gender discrimination is the pillar of the political structure, women and LGBTQIA+ individuals from all intersections of identities pay a higher price to live and survive every day in public and private spaces. Today, the exact number of women, queer people, and children whose lives were taken or were injured during the massacres remains a question for which we sadly do not have an answer yet. Nevertheless, the fact that so many women and LGBTQIA+ people from all generations put their lives at risk beyond a brave act of agency, knowing they have been the first targets of this oppression machinery, is the loudest and most radical signal to both the Iranian authorities and the world. We deserve freedom like any other nation." And this was after the massacres from the state. This was, weeks before the current war. But I wanted to mention that this is a statement that we released, understanding that it was very important, of course, to be in solidarity specifically with women and LGBTIQ queer folks. So I'll speak a bit about, as you mentioned, this bringing a queer perspective to peace and conflict, quote unquote, PACS, like scholarship framing, and then turn towards the work that I've done, the Women, Peace and Security framing. So I was really drawn towards looking at this now really robust scholarship of bringing a feminist and gender perspective to international relations and peace studies, but as a lesbian, very, I would say annoyed at the lack of attention to lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women's experiences, and really the lack of attention to sexual orientation and gender identity as a dimension of lived experience in conflict, but also I've been turning more so towards what it means to not recognize the really important leadership of queer and trans folks when you're thinking about everyday peace, when you're thinking about what it is in terms of safety and security we're working for, right? So I was really curious if this exclusion was intentional or if it was, in part or in large part due to heteronormative and cisgender assumptions that are just kind of baked in to a lot of the even feminist approaches to peace and security work. And so I've really been committed to bringing a queer perspective in terms of, yes, inclusion of LGBTQ people, but also queering what these words mean. And certainly When I came to work in women, peace, and security spaces in 2012, again, I would say, and I say this most times I'm invited to speak, I would see 200-page documents that wouldn't even include the acronym LGBTQ, let alone say lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. And I had experiences of people saying directly to me, like, that's not really part of what we're doing here. Looking at sexual orientation and gender identity is not this work. And in fact, the 10 resolutions of Women, Peace, and Security, which is the framing to bring a gender perspective to peace and security, do not list sexual orientation, gender identity, or LGBTQ in any of the resolutions. Of course, that doesn't mean that you can't have an expansive approach to how you implement gender, and that's what I have been advocating and working with organizations to do. But just constantly reminding people that not all women are heterosexual, and that it's actually a really important harm reduction work to intentionally define these terms, to intentionally reach out to lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women in spaces that are funded to do women's peace-building work, to work on feminist issues. And also, given our topic today, what I have also been saying is that looking at the attack on gender rights, the rollback on feminist activism, of course, it's never been separate. The organizations that are attacking feminist rights have never seen LGBTQ as something that's separate. So the fact that the organizations that have been doing, tasked with bringing a gender perspective, maybe intentionally, maybe not, have excluded LGBTQ folks has meant that in many of the more institutionalized spaces, we're definitely on the back foot in terms of responding to the very prevalent, very obviously targeted attacks on especially trans women. But so when I do the work that I'm trying to bring queer theory into practice, I wanted to point to two different things that I've worked on in the past couple years. One is co-developing a toolkit for queering women, peace, and security in practice. And that was co-developed with Columbia Diversa and Christian Aid. And we focused on three different things. One was kind of queering the pillars of women, peace, and security, which is protection, participation, prevention, relief, and recovery. So this is about, preventing violence against women. That was kind of like generally how it was initially framed, right? And actually most of women, peace, and security kind of still focuses on gender-based violence. But also the emphasis and need for collaboration between feminist and LGBTQ organizations. And that is happening, especially in like I use the examples in my book of Northern Ireland and Colombia. And in my experience with working with grassroots organizations, generally queer feminist spaces where there's already a lack of funding and already extensive kind of targeted attacks on using the word feminist, they're already working in collaboration out of necessity, right? They would already be going for the same funds. They would already be facing the same individuals that would be showing up to their physical spaces, right, and their public actions. So there's already this collaboration. Whether or not that translates then to national and international is a different story, right? So the third point is looking at national action plans, which is another one of the main ways that kind of women, peace, and security is seen as happening. But I would say that increasingly there's been this emphasis on needing to domesticate the women, peace, and security agenda to recognize that, everyday peace is something that needs to be taken seriously. We need to look at the colonialism that's happening at home, police violence happening at home. And I guess just in terms of, I know everyone on this panel is fantastic. We've done a terrible job sticking to time. So I'm going to leave on this last point for my book. I looked at the Lesbian History Archives, and I was really curious because I know lesbians have been organizing and doing peace work. The narratives of lesbian leadership in this space kind of does not get narrated, certainly as part of WPS, but as part of peace building in general. And I was struck by the one box that was like in a closet at the Lesbian History Archives from the Beijing Women's Conference in '95, had flyers that you could literally see like at any of, this sort of anti-gender attack that you would see very easily now. Kind of the idea of why is the West obsessed with sex? The West is holding up the document, talking about the document at Beijing, right? And this is not something that developing countries are interested in. And then, so I include some of those flyers in my book, so I can talk a little bit more about that. But in a way, I laugh because it's like we've been facing this for decades. So this is like, it's funded differently and maybe more visible in different ways, but like it's very familiar to lesbian and feminist activists, right?
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you all so much for these really powerful reflections. I realize I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I think I'm just going to scrap a lot of my questions and maybe just bundle them up into one and let you all, whoever wants to react briefly, can react. But these were, it's hard to listen to these contributions because it really signals how challenging the world is for many vulnerable people in this moment. At the same time, what was interesting, and it's also a bizarre moment when we think about, the way LGBT people are portrayed as foreign intrusions in many parts of the world, how we also see, there's other countries that have tanks with rainbow flags on them. We see wars justified to then protect other countries from LGBT rights. It is a really bizarre world, all while, in the global north, also we see funding rolled back for pride events, as Dan mentioned. We see attacks on trans people. We see a serious rollback and intensive violence in countries that have claimed to have some standing on LGBT rights. But what was really interesting in the comments to me was that this is also not entirely new either. There were a lot of reflections, talking about Iraq, talking about HIV/AIDS of crisis that LGBTQ people have navigated. And I think, also as someone who researches LGBT people, I think Dan made a point that, in these perilous moments, there's also usually some innovation, or there's some ways to build community or to resist in certain ways. And so my one reflection that I would just pass on to the panelists, if whoever wants to say a few words, is how do we approach this moment, either in global North countries or global South countries you're from or countries you study, as a way to address some of these challenges that we have. And you can take this in many different ways. It's an incredibly broad topic, but I would maybe just go back in the order yeah. Well, actually, why don't you think about that, and then I'll also open it up to the floor, which is actually great, and then we'll collect a few questions, and then we can do a round. I propose that we collect 3 questions. And then we'll go back to each of the panelists and they can take the ones they choose. Thank you. Sorry.
I wanted to ask, as English speakers, how do you interact with pre-colonial queerness in your culture whilst disentangling it from colonial narratives?
Hi, I actually wanted to comment on the commercialization of pride and commodification of queerness on a global scale. And I was wondering, do you think that collaboration with the neoliberal system or seeking admission via capital is like a subject, while it's exclusionary, of course, are there dynamics that we either can or inevitably need to work with? So can commodification be a site of resistance? And if so, how? Hi, I just wanted to ask a question on women and sapphic liberation and get your thoughts on whether you think that, like what you said about queering international human rights, is possible, or whether you're arguing too much of a system that is built on patriarchal and colonial foundations, like whether this is a system that can accommodate this kind of change in the first place.
Great. Maybe we'll stop here. So these are wonderful questions that actually fit very well with various themes that the panelists have brought up. And so just to kind of sum up, we have a question about vernacularization and translation from English, thinking about coloniality. We have a question about commodification and pride, and can there be any liberation in there? And then we have the final question related to the the systems that are in place and whether there can be any potential within them. So may I go to you first, Rahul? Yeah, and then in the next round we'll go the other direction. Yeah.
Maybe I'll address the first question about pre-colonial queerness because this is something I've been very interested in. The literature often makes a distinction between same-sex desire and behavior and acts and identity. Identity being an aspect of personhood. And following Michel Foucault's thesis in the history of sexuality, many scholars in that Foucauldian vein would argue that sexuality becomes an aspect of identity at a very particular time in Europe in the 19th century through discourses of medicine and psychoanalysis and literature and so forth. So that's a very culturally specific development. There is a temptation everywhere, I think, to look to the past for legitimation. And yet, we're doing something anachronistic when we do that, because if sexuality arises at a certain moment in time, then perhaps the pre-colonial period doesn't really have evidence of sexuality. It has evidence of something else, of same-sex desire, and people have called this different things. David Halperin suggests that what we're doing when we compare the present to the past is not looking at identity, exactness, but identification, resonance, a resemblance without being the same. This isn't just a matter of linguistic translation, it's also about conceptual translation. We may not find instances of identity in the past, but we can certainly locate instances of desire that were considered legitimate, even if they were minoritarian practices. I think we also need to pay attention to queer phobia in the past, including in the pre-colonial past, because if we don't pay attention to that, we're effectively romanticizing the pre-colonial as a period of tolerance before the bad colonial authorities came along and changed everything through penal codes and so forth. So I think turning to the past is important as a source of inspiration and legitimation, but we have to be willing to face up to the full and complex ugliness of that terrain if we are to be honest with ourselves.
Thanks, Rahul. Just to also add on to the question of language, as well as also tying to the question of how can we change international human rights systems themselves in queering. So these two, if you look at kind of what I mentioned before about the domestic decriminalization jurisprudence, there is a lot of value in going into that case law, because on the one hand, while all the speakers also recognize that there is this kind of Western imposition that people think when you talk about LGBT rights, the way that most of these cases recognize that these are colonial laws that have been imposed, and I accept Rahul's comments that there is that it's not just the fact that before colonization that it was all perfect either. But the roots of these laws have been imposed on the colonies through as a result of colonization. And therefore, while independence has been secured for these countries and new constitutions enshrine these values, these constitutional values are inconsistent with these colonial laws, which discriminate and marginalize these communities within your countries of LGBT people and perpetuate stigma. So one of the main arguments that have been successful is really talking about where do these laws come from and finding where the roots of the laws are. In the Pacific, most of the countries that have inherited penal codes have inherited through the Queensland Penal Code. And in Asia, it's through the Indian Penal Code that have been promulgated in other parts of Asia. So tracing those and making arguments in favor of the fact that these laws have still continued to be in statute books and still continued to discriminate people is one way that you can say that this is not something that is advancing of constitutional values in your country. And secondly, on the question of how can we change the international treaty body systems or the international human rights law system? And it's true, as Jamie mentioned, in any of the resolutions that come about, in any of kind of the human rights world, because it's such a contentious issue, people don't really talk about LGBT rights, or there is almost an exclusion, which is not a coincidence. So in the absence of, unlike persons with disabilities, women who do have conventions, UN conventions that are ratified by state parties around the world, where do you find international legal protection for LGBT people? And this is where domestic law, again, has been extremely helpful, where where courts around the world have interpreted their constitution on right to privacy, on equality, on non-discrimination, and included and interpreted these provisions to also include sexual orientation. So you're not just thinking about the right to privacy in a very limited sense, but you're also thinking about it in a sense of how do LGBT people, how does sexual orientation can be encompassed into it? And this jurisprudence has been developed in the last 20 years. And right now, where the world is at in terms of what I talked about, the most recent case in St. Lucia, there is freedom of expression to include sexual orientation. There's also recognition of the right to life, of different constitutionally entrenched provisions of liberties that apply to every single human being in your country to also extend to LGBT people. So in the absence of where you don't have international law that do spell it out, there has been a growing trend in domestic law around the world in the global south that have extended this protection to LGBT people.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll go to Dan first. Dan, would you?
Thank you. Thanks for the question about the commercialization of pride. And, it is important to acknowledge the dilemma that activists and we all face within capitalism, and we need money, of course, to live. And I sometimes sort of think about Jack Halberstam's sort of intonation that we must steal from the university. And I think for a sort of queer activists, I sometimes think if you're offered money, or you can get money, or you can get something from an institution or organization, there's a temptation to say, why wouldn't you take it? And there's a pragmatic kind of position to say, well, within constrained circumstances, that's what we just have to do. And certainly in my book, I sort of talk about, for example, Hong Kong Pride, which is working class Cantonese activists, very closely associated to the pro-democracy movement as it then was. They had taken money off of corporations who had said, you must not have any pro-democracy figures on the stage, and they just ignored them. They just went ahead. Of course, the consequences of that, they didn't get the money again. And across the sort of the activists, particularly in South Africa, I've spoken to, there is that kind of strong anti-capitalist sort of ideological drive, but also that pragmatic feeling that they will take money from institutions if they mean well. I think what's revealing about that, though, and I think this is the key thing, is that corporate money is both limited and limiting. In any Pride event, once you have corporate money involved, you have to be clear it's not that much money, but it has a huge impact on that event. And you've entered into this sort of conceit that capitalism is your sort of rescuer, that this is part and parcel of the party, that's what frames the Pride event. And if we take the example of Soweto Pride again, they've been very clear to me, the organizers, across my research, if I could connect them with any of these corporate EDI people that could help, they were interested in that. But what really transpired is that corporate sponsors who were interested at that point in being involved in Pride were not interested in being involved in Soweto Pride, because Soweto Pride is organized by Black lesbians in a township in South Africa, and they talk about violence. And that's not something that homocapitalism is interested in. So I think it's important to acknowledge the sort of dilemma we all face within capitalism, but it's also important to be clear. Corporate sponsorship is always limited and limiting. And the final thing I'd say, yesterday I did a book talk at Wits with Bev Ditzy, organised the first Pride in Johannesburg. And last year she held a picnic in a park as an alternative Pride. And I would rather attend that picnic in the park than Johannesburg Pride, which is a huge music festival heavily sponsored. So I think we can hold Pride events that do eschew corporate money.
It's on.
Okay, is it on? Okay, so I will just really quickly make a point about the commodification to just add that I would say, yeah, it can be used as a site of resistance, but it really depends on your individual access to power and privilege. And so ideally, someone else gets commodified and then gives you the money, I would say. And until the end of capitalism, right? During late stage capitalism, ideally, someone else gets the funding and then gives the organization or the organizers like the money to do with as they want and be left alone. But I wanted to pick up on this question of women and sapphic liberation, and really the question of, is it possible to queer human rights, which immediately makes me think of Die Otto's Edited Volume. But I also think about Laura Joberg's work, where while I was working on my dissertation, she essentially said to me, like, get rid of all the justification that you're doing. Like, stop justifying yourself, stop spending so much energy to kind of like make the case for why this is important. And I would say that having documents by the independent expert on SOGI that do reference and cite lots of organizations doing work on peace and security. Not to say that they're relying on the state and trusting that international human rights are going to be implemented and supported by their state, but there is a real importance in doing that justification, having that citation, having that history. And so I would say there's a real value in that. And then in terms of, I would say the Queering International Law book and Ratna Kapoor's chapter specifically, which really says, no, we really need the radicality that international human rights law kind of flattens. I found that actually one of the most difficult things to read because I read it after I'd written my Queering Women, Peace and Security article in 2016. And anyway, I've been continually, like I taught it this week, and I'm always sitting with it when I'm thinking about the both and, the queer project of working with these international systems. And I would say that, yeah, we're not going to get liberation and the radical future we want only with these systems. But I think to appeal back to Sarah Schulman's work and also Urvashi Vyas, is that correct? How to say that? Their work on, they recently published a book about different strategies to engage in, amid the anti-gender backlash, right? And one of the points they make is solidarity thrives in direct action. Urvashi passed away a couple of years ago, I should say. But drawing on the really foundational coalitional work that they were a part of and really led the way with. They say solidarity thrives in direct action in the plurality of strategy and tactic, not consensus. And I think there's so much tension in that, so much tension in having solidarity across these different strategies. And this absolutely goes back to ACT UP and kind of how ACT UP had their approach to activism. So I guess in that way, I would say, no, it's not enough, but it's part of the larger, threads of how we'll, reach liberation.
Great. Thank you all. All right, I'm going to hand it back to the audience. Who's next? All right, so I think.
Thank you all very much for your introduction. Very, very interesting. I have a question for Janie. I thought just your brief about Northern Ireland reminded me of a quote from Jennifer Grisham about how Black coalition have been led to LGBT right things through the back door of the Women's Coalition. And I suppose that makes me want to ask a question about the risk or the fear of rights acquisition becoming a distraction against social transformation of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviours. Yeah.
We'll take two more.
Thank you so much for all these comments. It's been fascinating. It's a question for anyone, but I want to pull on the thread, Rahul, of your comments about refusing the false choice between imperialism and authoritarianism. And my question comes from, until recently I was working in DC amongst a community of critical feminists who suddenly found ourselves beginning of last year in a situation of trying to question whether we should be rather unsuccessfully defending the existence of programs, institutions that we had been in a position of wrongly critiquing, including game programs, media programs, etc. And that brings me to the question of, this time, of course, as you mentioned, is not necessarily unprecedented or has never occurred before. How do you balance maintaining imperial or anti-imperial criticism and maintaining criticism and critiques while of institutions that may also be under threat for their very existence now from rising authoritarian groups and including our LGBTIQ rights organizations and resisting pressure under authoritarianism to just resort to the lowest common denominator, which often leaves out the most vulnerable. Thank you.
We're speaking about democracy backsliding or this backlash, homophobia, simply shrinking of queer places. I'm just wondering if any of you or all of you can contemplate whether anything that gay campaigners and activists did in the last couple of days might have contributed to it, or it's all external.
All right, so we will go in the reverse direction this time with James. So we have a question on Northern Ireland, backdoor. We have a question on how do we critique in an effective way. We have a question on, is there a response to advocacy that provokes backlash? And we'll start with Jamie and then go in the reverse order.
So I'll just respond to the first question about Northern Ireland. And I think this, what I took from that question is in part this question about whether or not focusing on rights is a distraction. I think Northern Ireland is a really interesting example, given that there's been, the collapsing government and kind of what I heard from organizers, activists, which, let's be real, is a very small group of people that rotate through these, 1-year consultative roles, is that we're constantly just writing to this government, and then is it actually getting implemented? What are we doing? What is the point of these reviews that never get implemented? And I think it is absolutely a distraction when, and you could argue that about women, peace, and security as well. I mean, there's many countries that have 4 or 5 women, peace, and security national action plans, and then if you track what the implementation actually looks like, it's paltry. So I do think I would say that if the promoting rights can be a way to coalition build, if it can be a way to shift definitional approaches, to shift the ways that other organizations, the way that politicians are doing the work they're doing. It isn't actually, in my view, about securing the law. It's about doing that advocacy and education that comes with it. And, that's, for example, I think right now in Northern Ireland, the focus on conversion therapy, quote unquote, is one that I've seen where there's so much, it's the panels are, of course, about education, coalition, and connecting. And yes, of course, it is about passing legislation, but really mostly it's using this campaign as a way to connect. I do think, there's a lot that can be said about, how you get the law and what the definitions that go with that, which there's a lot of criticism about, again, Resolution 1325 and how that kind of, which state promoted it as the Security Council and kind of how that's actually posturing by the state to kind of use women's rights as a way to kind of perform in the international stage. I think that's absolutely a fair critique. But I would also say, the folks doing these consultations are aware of that and they're kind of choosing whether or not the larger project of the campaign can serve other ends, right? Always kind of this is going to serve these 3 ends. It's not just towards this consultation, right?
Thank you. Dan, we'll go back to you.
I'll go mainly with the question of what is have LGBT activists done anything? I mean, like I sort of said in my comments, I think all the work around the value of LGBT people to the economy, the business case of LGBT people, pride events that were just about parties and drinking and just celebration. I'm not saying we can't celebrate, but I think such things totally divorced LGBT activism from social justice, made LGBT subjects who weren't productive or who were marginalized dispensable. And such figurations of LGBT life as being economically productive, we made all of ourselves dispensable. So I think in a sort of way that set the foundation for a precarity for LGBT communities. And we've kind of increasingly been dispensed in sort of right-wing backlash. And just briefly, I know it was a question for Rahul, but the sort of second question was about sort of development. And I think Rahul's absolutely right. If we could have development money protected, aside from the sort of imperial post-colonial politics of that, we would want that protected. And one of the tragic sites in Johannesburg are LGBT-focused sexual and mental health clinics, barely a year old, closed and empty because they were funded entirely by USAID and closed overnight. So the withdrawal of development from the global north has had huge impacts across the world.
Thanks. I'll just make a quick comment about the comment that was made about authoritarianism and the rise in authoritarianism, and how in countries as Mali and Burkina Faso, where there are military juntas, and they have implemented for the first time in the country's history laws that criminalize same-sex intimacy. And so there is a link of where these authoritarian regimes are controlling power. There is a link between how they also bring about laws that further marginalize and discriminate LGBT people.
Thanks for those great questions. On the question you asked, there's long been a left-wing critique of aid as an instrument of imperialism. And yet when the aid flows dry up, that is not a vindication of that critique. They're drying up for the wrong reason. Similarly with EDI, right? There's long been a left-wing critique of EDI as shallow, as window dressing. But the right-wing critique is very different. It's that EDI is, it's sort of making victims of straight white men, etc. I think EDI is a good thing to think with because it's also something we're very familiar with in our own institutional environments. For my sins, I was EDI director of my school, and I had to do things like the Athena Swan action plan for my department. I think the shallowness of EDI is precisely why it's been so easy to dismantle. EDI is not a sign that you put up in the shop front to say, look how good we are. It really should be a stick with which to beat your institution or your employer to get it to behave better. And so, it's in a sense, the reason for its disappearance is directly related to the shallowness of the institution. And then very quickly, the question on democratic backsliding and whether gay rights activists have something to blame. I totally agree with what Dan was saying. And I think actually, Dan, you gave a really great example with the gentrification of Cape Town Pride. I mean, the more Cape Town Pride looks like Amsterdam, the more Jacob Zuma's comment about LGBT rights being Dutch law acquires credibility. And so the problem really is that LGBT politics has become a kind of single issue politics for elite activists, totally divorced from what makes life livable for the vast majority of society. And it's that single issue-ness of it that accounts for its shallowness and the ease with which it's been rolled back in so many places. Not the only reason, but one of the big reasons.
Wonderful. Yeah, I will just add on the backlash quickly that there's always so much space for critique within our own movements. The interesting thing about anti-gender campaigns, though, is that I often preempt sometimes even where there's no movements really asking for much, because a lot of frames attacking LGBT people also diffuse across borders, are used, by actors for political gain or to foment some kind of support or policy. So it's a complicated, this term backlash has been critiqued a lot in the literature, and that we have to think of it, is it really, what came first, what is backlashing what, and it's a very tricky and messy space. All right, I do want to go back to the audience again because we have 6 minutes left. I think we can, these are fantastic questions, by the way, from the audience, so thank you. So let's get in a couple more and then we'll ask our speakers to just very briefly respond to them one last round. Okay, so yeah.
I just wanted to ask, when it comes to the increasing transphobic policy around endorsing gender norms, how do you think that might disproportionately affect people of color due to a white-centric idea of gender expression?
Mm-hmm.
Which do you think is most productive from a liberation point of view in difficult times, hope or hopelessness?
This kind of builds off the first question was asked. I'm just wondering, how can we use LGBTQ rights to more explicitly target the anti-trans movements in the global north, like especially where in the US and the UK, there's explicit targeting of trans people that often like comes through our democratically elected governments, like what we're seeing with Trump in the US, but also here with the Labour Party in the UK.
Great, thank you. Any burning last question from someone? All right, so we have, Rahul, we're gonna go to you first again. We have a question about gender norms and whiteness. We have a question about hope and hopelessness, and we have a question about anti-trans policies in the US and the UK.
Thank you. That was a great question about how transphobia and gender norms affect people of color. This has to do with the ways in which hegemonic notions of gender identity are rooted in whiteness. Our ideas of what a man and a woman look like are rooted very much in the image of white bearers of those gender identities. Controversies in sport are very illuminating of this. It's no accident that women of color athletes are disproportionately targeted in gender identity controversies in sport precisely because their phenotypes are seen to depart much more from the norm than white female athletes. I'm thinking of cases like Caster Semenya, for example. And so while that's a sort of elite level example, I think that operates in everyday life as well, where the standard is white. And so people of color are more likely to fail that standard and to be disproportionately affected by attempts to enforce it. The question on hope and hopelessness, this reminds me of a Walter Benjamin quote where he says, struggle is better fueled by the desire not by the desire for a better life for one's children, but I'm paraphrasing here, not the hope for a better life for one's children, but revenge for what has been done to one's ancestors. Make of that what you will, but I think I'm in a sort of making an argument for hopelessness here.
Thanks. I think I'd take the opposite of, I'm going to advocate for hope. And why I say I advocate for hope is actually stemming from my experience working with people in the Pacific, where the Pacific Islanders, LGBT activists, are at the forefront of the climate disaster that this world is facing. But when you speak to LGBT activists in the Pacific, and you visit their countries and you talk to their communities, they know that the very country that they live on is not going to exist in the next 50 years. They know that everything that the scientists have predicted, like in Maldives in the next 50 years, these islands are going to be water. But yet, they are so conscious of the fact that for not just their own generation, but for their children. They talk about how they have very kind of, not just in a very traditional sense of family, their uncles and aunts, their children are also part of their family. Their sense of community is very strong. And then how that, even though these children might not identify as in the kind of heteronormative way, that we need to make sure that there are no longer criminalizing laws in our country. Even if there is no country in a territorial sense, that the identity that they find in the fact that that these laws still criminalize sexual expression, gender identity, especially in the sense of where in the Pacific, sexual orientation and gender identity, there are very diverse people in these regions. And so it's really a historical origin that needs to be recognized, and that hope towards legal change, to removing laws so that their future would be more equitable for their children.
Thank you. We'll go to Dan and then Jamie, just briefly, because we're running short on time. Yeah.
Sure. Great question about hope or hopelessness. And I like that quote Rahul said. I think hopelessness is an important emotion to sit with sometimes, because the examples I gave from South Africa and, the 1980s for queer communities and AIDS, hopelessness was real. And of course, on an individual level, people could simply never see justice. They would never see a resolution that would make their lives better. But from that, and I think it's in that quote maybe that Rahul was saying, one of the responses both in South Africa and from ACT UP was anger, and anger for a desire for change. So hopelessness can be productive and can in a sort of way lead to hope. And then if we think, the organizers of Soweto Pride, for example, say, we are angry on the streets. Our pride is an angry pride, because that's the society we live in. So I don't think things are mutually exclusive, but hopelessness is important to sit with sometimes, because that's what we face. So.
Thank you, Jane.
So I'll just say on the question about responding to anti-trans policies that I do think, and what I've seen movements doing, is folding it into larger attacks on bodily autonomy. Again, remembering that everyone has a sexual orientation and a gender identity, and that this surveillance and governance of sexuality is really harmful to all of us in maybe ways that weren't as evident prior to having to register your body in ways that trans folks have been facing if they want to get protections or access to, say, basic public health care. So I do think making that connection is a really important way to respond to these attacks. And I would say in terms of the hope or hopelessness, exactly as was already said, I really find that there is a lot of hope in difficult spaces. And I look at the organizing for the Lavender Menace, and also this group called Revolting Lesbians, where their placards read, "Resistance is not enough, revolt, revolt, revolt." And I just really love the organizing that they've been doing, specifically resisting ICE and attacks on people of color in the U.S. So I would definitely say that there's joyful spaces in resisting exclusion, as these lesbian and queer organizations have been doing.
Wonderful. It's been such an honor for me to sit here next to these fantastic speakers. I also want to thank, just briefly, Aparna Ravi, Samar Anuptawi, Maki Kimura, Alan Rennick, Lizette Cabana, all these folks behind. I'm just the moderator, but there's a lot of people that went into organizing this and bringing everyone here. So thank you all to my colleagues and to my speakers. And before we clap for them, I want to also just let you know that our next Policy and Practice event is on Thursday, March 19th. So next week, it's the Postcolonial Academy, Knowledge, Memory, and Liberation. That's the topic, and you can sign up for it on our website. Thank you all so much for joining us, and please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers.